In the serene town of Crescent Falls, a series of grisly discoveries lead to a harrowing manhunt. Who is the elusive Huntsman, and what is his connection to the darkness that threatens to consume the community? Get ready to explore the unknown with every step. Subscribe now for the adventure of a lifetime. And so the story of the Huntsman became one of the many tales whispered about in Crescent Falls, a reminder of the darkness that can touch even the most tranquil places. But it also became a testament to resilience, to the power of community, and to the enduring human spirit that refuses to be broken by fear. In the end, we all carry our scars, but it's how we choose to move forward that defines us. For me, I chose to embrace my role as a protector, to stand watch over my town and to ensure that the shadows never again take us by surprise. My name is Cormac Dogan, and this happened to me on a sweltering summer evening in July 2005. I was working as a search and rescue officer in the dense forests of northern Idaho, a place where the trees seemed to close in around you and the world felt far removed from civilization. You know, the kind of place where cell phone reception is a joke and the only sounds you hear at night are the rustling leaves and distant calls of wildlife. I was called out for a search operation involving a missing hiker, Jared Collins, a 27-year-old guy who had come up from Boise for some solo backpacking. The guy was supposed to check in with his friends the night before, but they hadn't heard a peep. The next morning they called us and I got dispatched with a couple of my teammates, Jack Monroe and Carl Easton. Jack was the kind of guy who could find a needle in a haystack, and Carl had this sixth sense about him, knowing where to look before anyone else had a clue. We geared up, loaded our packs with the essentials: water, first aid kits and radios, and headed into the forest. The air was thick with humidity and the sky was a dull grey, promising rain that never came. We split up to cover more ground. I took the trail to the east, the one less traveled. Jared's friends had said he was an experienced hiker, so I figured he might have strayed from the main paths to explore, as I treed deeper into the woods. The canopy above thickened and the underbrush grew denser. The only sounds were my footsteps and the occasional chirp of a bird. About an hour in, I found the first sign of him: a torn piece of a map snagged on a thorn bush. The edges were frayed and the paper was damp with dew. I radioed in my location, but got no response. The signal was spotty out here. I pressed on, following what I guessed was Jared's trail. The forest seemed to close in tighter and the light dimmed as the trees thickened. Then I saw it, a backpack half buried under a pile of leaves. It was a decent one, the kind you'd trust on a serious hike, not some department store knockoff. I crouched down and rummaged through it. There was food, water, a compass and a few personal items. Nothing out of the ordinary, but no sign of Jared. I marked the spot with some bright tape and moved on, more alert. Now something wasn't right. The forest felt different here, almost like it was watching me. I shrugged off the thought. I've been in these woods more times than I can count. It's easy to let your mind play tricks on you. Another hour passed and the sun was starting to dip when I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. There in a small clearing was a crude campsite, a fire pit, long cold in what looked like blood stains on the rocks. I got closer, and that's when I saw it, a shoe half covered in dirt with a foot still in it. My heart pounded. I radioed again, hoping to God that Jack or Carl would pick up this time. Jack's voice crackled through the static. "Jack, here, you find something?" "Yeah," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "A campsite looks bad. Got a shoe here with a foot in it." "Stay put." Jack said, "We are on our way." I waited, my eyes scanning the surrounding trees. The forest was eerily silent. Now not a bird or rustle to be heard. Minutes felt like hours until I finally saw Jack and Carl emerging through the trees. Jack took one look at the scene and swore under his breath. We didn't waste time. We marked the location and started a grid search. Darkness was falling and the air grew cooler. My flashlight cut through the shadows, revealing nothing but more trees and underbrush. Then a scream sharp and close. We all froze. Jared Carl shouted and we bolted toward the sound. We found him, or what was left of him. Jared's body was slumped against a tree. His face pale and lifeless, eyes wide open in terror. His torso was of claw marks and torn flesh. I felt bile rise in my throat. Jack checked for a pulse, but it was clear he was gone. We need to get out of here, Carl said, his voice shaking. Whatever did this could still be around. We started to backtrack, moving quickly but cautiously. The forest seemed alive. Now every shadow a potential threat. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting something to leap out at us. We finally reached a ridge where our radios worked better. Jack called in for backup and a medical team. We were told to hold our position and wait. As we waited, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end and every crack of a twig made me jump. Carl was pacing his flashlight, darting back and forth while Jack stood guard, his hand on his knife. After what felt like an eternity, the backup arrived. We guided them to Jared's body in the campsite. The medics took over and the police began their investigation. We were debriefed and told to stay available for further questioning. I was exhausted mentally and physically. The drive back was silent. We all knew this wasn't the end of it. Whatever killed Jared was still out there. We had no answers, just more questions. The next day I was called in to talk to the local sheriff, a grizzled man named Frank Dalton. He had the kind of a face that looked like it had seen too much Cormac. He said, nodding, as I walked into his office. "Sit down, we need to go over your report." I sat and recounted everything again, every detail as best as I could remember. Frank listened, his brow furrowed. "We found tracks," he said when I finished. "Large claw don't match any known animal in the area. We are bringing in a specialist, but between you and me, I think this was no ordinary predator." I left the station with a heavy feeling in my chest. What the hell had we stumbled upon out there? Days turned into weeks and the investigation dragged on. The forest was combed over, but nothing new was found. Jared's death was ruled as an animal attack, but those of us who were there knew better. Something out there wasn't right, and it wasn't over. Jack and I were on another search and rescue mission a month later, when we found more evidence. This time it was a group of hikers who'd gone missing. We found their camp torn apart, much like Jared's, blood everywhere, but no bodies, just gone. We decided to stick together from then on, not wanting to split up and risk the same fate. It was during one of these joint searches that we finally encountered whatever it was. The air was thick with tension and the forest seemed unnaturally quiet. We heard movement and suddenly it was on us. It was fast, a blow of dark fur and claws. It moved with an intelligence that sent chills down my spine. Jack managed to get a shot off with his rifle, but it didn't seem to slow it down. Carl was the first to go, dragged off into the trees before we could react. His screams echoed through the forest. Then silence. Jack and I ran, our flashlights bobbing wildly. I tripped over a root, hitting the ground hard. Jack turned to help me up, and that's when it got him. I watched in horror as the thing tore into him, his screams filling the night. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not looking back. I don't know how long I ran, or how I found my way back to the main trail. I just remember bursting out of the trees covered in sweat and blood and collapsing. I was found by another search party hours later, babbling about a creature in the woods. The official reports were vague: animal attacks. They said stay out of the deep woods. But I knew the truth. Something was out there, something that didn't belong. I quit my job a week later, moved to a city where the biggest threat was a pickpocket. I don't go hiking anymore, don't even go near the woods. I hear about disappearances now and then, and I know that thing is still out there. So if you ever find yourself in northern Idaho, stick to the trails, and if you hear something in the woods, run, don't look back, just run. My name is Donovan Mercer, and what I'm about to tell you happened back in 1993. I was living in this small town called Deerbrook, nestled somewhere in the backwoods of Vermont. You've probably never heard of it. I was 28, working as a freelance journalist, piecing together a living writing for local papers and magazines. I lived alone in a cabin on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where neighbors are few and far between and everyone knows everyone's business, or so they think. The town of Deerbrook itself was nothing special, just a collection of old houses, a general store, a bar and a diner, but the woods surrounding it. They were different, dense, ancient and full of stories that locals liked to tell newcomers to see if they'd scare. I always thought those stories were just that, stories, until one day they weren't. It was late spring, and I was working on an article about local folklore. I'd interviewed a bunch of the old-timers, jotting down their tales of haunted woods and mysterious creatures. Most of it was the usual stuff: ghosts sighing, strange noises at night. You know the drill, but there was one story that stuck with me. It was about a creature that was said to live deep in the woods, something that walked on two legs but wasn't human. They called it the Beast of Deerbrook. I dismissed it as a local legend, but it made for good copy. One evening, just as the sun was setting, I got a call from old Harold Branson. Harold was one of the town's eccentrics, known for his tall tales and love of whiskey. He sounded frantic, urging me to come to his place right away. "I saw it, Donnie," he said, his voice trembling. "The beast. You've got to come and see for yourself now." Harold wasn't the most reliable source, but he seemed genuinely scared, so I grabbed my notepad, a flashlight, and headed out to his place, which was a good 5 miles deeper into the woods from my cabin. When I got there, Harold was pacing on his porch, a shotgun cradled in his arms. His face was pale, and his eyes darted around like he was expecting something to jump out of the shadows. He led me inside and poured us both a drink. I was out back chopping wood. He began, his hands shaking as he took a sip of his whiskey, and I saw it: big, dark, and standing on two legs. Looked like a wolf, but it wasn't too big, too upright. I listened, scribbling notes, though I remained skeptical. Harold took me out back to the spot where he claimed to have seen the creature. It was getting dark and the woods were quiet, almost eerily so. "Right there," he said, pointing to a patch of ground near the tree line. It was watching me. I swear we stood there for a while, but nothing happened. Eventually I left, chalking it up to Harold's imagination, fueled by too much whiskey. As I drove back to my cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I laughed it off, attributing it to Harold's contagious paranoia. A few days later I was out in the woods scouting locations for photos to accompany my article. The deeper I went, the more uneasy I felt. It was a thick part of the forest where the trees were so tall and close together that sunlight barely pierced through. I was about a mile in when I stumbled upon something that stopped me cold. There on the ground was a half-eaten deer carcass. Fresh blood still pooled around it, and there were large, deep claw marks on its flank. I'm no hunter, but I knew enough to recognize that this wasn't the work of any bear or mountain lion. The wounds were too clean, too deliberate. I took a few pictures, my hands shaking slightly as I stood up. I heard a rustling in the bushes behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding, but saw nothing the rest of that day. I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. I made my way back to the cabin, trying to stay calm that night. As I sat on my porch, the woods seemed to close in around me. The usual sounds of nature were absent, replaced by an oppressive silence. Over the next week, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, but every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. Then one night it got worse. I was lying in bed trying to sleep, when I heard something outside. At first it was just a faint scratching noise, like branches against the side of the cabin, but then it grew louder. More deliberate, I got up, grabbed the flashlight, and my old hunting knife. I didn't own a gun and cautiously stepped outside. The night was pitch black and the beam of my flashlight barely cut through the darkness. The scratching stopped, replaced by a heavy rhythmic breathing coming from the edge of the woods. I pointed the flashlight in that direction, and for a moment I saw it, two glowing eyes staring back at me from the darkness set in a massive shadowy figure. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The creature stepped closer, and I could see it more clearly. It stood about 7 foot tall, cut set in dark fur, with the head of a wolf but the body of a man. Its eyes were a haunting yellow, and its claws glinted in the light. I backed up slowly, my mind racing, then without warning it charged. I turned and ran back into the cabin, slamming the door shut and bolting it. The creature hit the door with such force that it shook on its hinges. I stumbled back, tripping over a chair, and scrambled to my feet for what felt like hours. The creature battered the cabin, growling and snarling. I could hear its claws scraping against the wood, trying to find a way in. I stayed in the middle of the room, clutching the knife, knowing it was useless against whatever that thing was. Just as suddenly as it had started, the assault stopped. The silence was deafening. I waited, listening intently, but there was nothing. Eventually exhaustion overtook my fear and I fell into a fitful sleep. The next morning I found deep gouges in the door and claw marks on the window frames. Whatever that thing was, it had come very close to getting inside. I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed up some essentials and headed into town, determined to warn the others and figure out what to do next. When I got to the diner, I found Harold and a few other locals there. I told them what had happened, expecting disbelief, but to my surprised eyes, they listened intently. "You're not the first to see it," Harold said grimly. "My granddad used to tell stories about a beast in these woods, said it was some kind of werewolf." The others nodded, exchanging uneasy glances. "We've all heard the stories," said Karen, the diner's owner, "but no one's ever had proof until now. We decided to form a group and head back to my cabin to see if we could find any more evidence. We armed ourselves with rifles and flashlights and made our way into the woods. The tension was palpable as we approached the cabin. The memory of the previous night's terror still fresh in my mind. As we searched the area, we found more claw marks on the trees and signs of a struggle. The ground was torn up and there were tufts of dark fur caught in the underbrush, but the creature itself was nowhere to be found. We stayed vigilant for the next few nights, taking turns keeping watch, but the beast never returned. Life in Deerbrook slowly went back to normal, but there was always an undercurrent of fear, a sense that something was still out there watching and waiting. A few weeks later, a hiker went missing in the woods. His name was Simon Hawke, a newcomer to Deerbrook. We found his campsite torn apart. His belongings scattered and blood on the ground, but no sign of Simon. The search parties combed the forest for days, but he was never found. The town was never the same. After that, people locked their doors at night and no one ventured into the woods alone. The beast of Deerbrook became more than just a story. It was a reality we all had to live with. As for me, I moved to the city a few months later, leaving the cabin and the memories behind, but even now, every time I hear a rustling in the bushes or a strange noise in the night, I can't help but wonder if it's still out there lurking in the shadows waiting for its next victim. My name is Caleb Drummond and I've been working as a park ranger for about 5 years now. My job isn't as exciting as some might think. Mostly it's just me making sure people follow the rules, picking up trash, and sometimes helping out lost hikers. I like it, though it's peaceful and the forest feels like home. But one day something happened that I still can't quite wrap my head around. It started like any other shift. I was stationed at a small, relatively unknown park in Oregon. Our park isn't one of those big tourist traps. It's mostly visited by locals who enjoy the peace and quiet. I knew almost every trail and tree by heart, which made what happened all the more unsettling. I was checking the northern boundary fence, which was about a mile from the main ranger station. It was a foggy morning, the kind that makes everything look like it's part of some old black and white movie. I had my coffee in one hand and my radio in the other, ready to call in if I found any damage or trespassers. That's when I first noticed something strange. A section of the fence was torn apart, not like it had been cut or broken by animals, but as if something had clawed its way through. I frowned, examining the damage. There were deep gouges in the wood, like someone had taken a huge rake to it. No animal around here could do that, and it didn't look like typical vandalism either. "Hey, Em," I said into my radio. Emily, my co-worker, and the closest thing I had to a best friend, responded immediately. "What's up?" "Caleb found some weird damage on the north fence, looks like something tore through it." "Any reports of bear sightings, or anything unusual negative on the bears?" "You think it's vandals, could be, but it doesn't look right." "I'll check it out, might take a bit." "Roger that, stay safe, Caleb." I decided to follow the trail of broken wood and gouged earth, hoping it would lead me to whoever, or whatever had done this. As I walked, the forest seemed unnaturally quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my own footsteps and the occasional crackle of my radio. About a quarter-mile in, I found something that made my blood run cold. It was a campsite, but it looked like a tornado had hit it. Tents were shredded, camping gear was strewn everywhere, and there was blood. Not a lot, but enough to know someone had been hurt. I scanned the area looking for any sign of the campers. "Emily, I found a trashed campsite, looks bad, blood and debris everywhere." "No sign of people yet." "Caleb, that doesn't sound good." "Want me to call in backup?" "Not yet. Let me see if I can find any clues." I poked around the campsite, trying to pie together what happened. There were 2 tents, enough for a small family or a couple of friends. One tent was completely destroyed and the other had its flap open, with some belongings still inside. Then I saw a set of tracks leading away from the campsite and into the denser part of the forest. They were large, almost human, but too big and oddly shaped. Against my better judgment, I decided to follow them. The tracks were fresh, and if someone was hurt, they might need help. The trail led deeper into the woods, and as I went further, the trees seemed to close in around me. The fog thickened, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. Suddenly I heard a rustling noise behind me. I spun around, my hand instinctively reaching for my flashlight. Nothing, just the silent trees and the ever-present fog. I shook my head, trying to dispel the growing sense of unease. The tracks eventually led me to a small clearing. In the center of the clearing there was a massive tree, gnarled and ancient. Looking at its base I found more blood, and what looked like torn pieces of clothing. My heart was pounding. Now a mix of fear and adrenaline. I moved closer to the tree, my flashlight beam cutting through the fog. That's when I saw it. A figure hunched and twisted, crouched near the base of the tree. It was humanoid, but its proportions were all wrong. 2 tall limbs, 2 long skin, pale and mottled. It looked up at me and I froze. Its eyes were the worst part, large, dark and empty, like looking into a void for a moment. We just stared at each other. Then it moved fast and fluid, disappearing into the forest with a speed that seemed impossible. I stood there, hard hammering, trying to process what I'd just seen. My radio crackled to life, startling me. "Caleb, you there? You're not answering. What's going on?" I fumbled for the radio, my hands shaking. "Emily." I saw something, not sure what was, but it was wrong. "I'm heading back." "Caleb, you're scaring me." "Just come back. We'll call in the authorities." I didn't need to be told twice. I retraced my steps, almost running, trying to put as much distance between me and that clearing as possible. By the time I made it back to the ranger station, Emily was waiting for me, looking worried what happened out there. She asked. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I don't know, something attacked that campsite and I think it hurt someone. I saw tracks, followed them to a clearing and there was something there not human. Emily's face paled. We need to call this in now. We reported the incident to the authorities, who organized a search team to investigate. They found the campsite, the tracks and even some of the blood I'd mentioned, but there was no sign of the creature I'd seen, nor any of the campers. It was like they had vanished into thin air. The search went on for days, but no new evidence turned up. The authorities were baffled and the official report listed the incident as unexplained. I was questioned repeatedly, but I had no answers to give. All I could do was replay the events in my mind, trying to make sense of something that defied all logic in the weeks that followed. The park remained closed to the public. Emily and I were reassigned to other duties while the investigation continued. But the memory of that day stayed with me, haunting my thoughts and dreams. What had I seen? What had happened to those campers? One evening, a few weeks later, Emily and I were having a beer at a local bar trying to unwind. The conversation drifted back to that day, as it often did. You really think it was some kind of creature? She asked, taking a sip of her drink. I shrugged. I don't know what else to call. It wasn't human, that's for sure. Maybe some kind of undiscovered species, something that doesn't belong here. Emily nodded slowly. It's just hard to believe, but I saw the damage, the tracks. Something did that. We sat in silence for a while, lost in our thoughts. Then Emily spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. You know, there's a local legend about a creature that lives in these woods. They call it the lurker. Supposedly it's been around for centuries, hunting those who wander too far from the beaten path. I raised an eyebrow. You believe in that stuff? She shrugged. I didn't, but after what we saw. I don't know, Caleb. Maybe there's some truth to it. The idea of the lurker stuck with me, and I found myself researching local folklore whenever I had the chance. The stories were varied, but they all described a similar creature, tall, pale and terrifying, a hunter of the night preying on the unwary. The park eventually reopened, but things were never quite the same. Emily and I remained vigilant, always on edge, waiting for something to happen. We never saw the creature again, but the fear lingered a shadow over our peaceful forest. I don't know what really happened that day, and I probably never will, but I do know one thing: the woods aren't as safe as they seem. There are things out there, things we don't understand, and sometimes it's better to leave them be. My name is Griffin Mulligan, and I'm the kind of guy who's had his share of ups and downs. I've never been afraid to roll up my sleeves and get my hands dirty, and maybe that's why I thought a weekend getaway to my uncle's cabin in the woods would be the perfect escape. Life in the city had been stressful lately: long hours at the office, a messy breakup, and just the general grind that makes you question your sanity. So when my buddy Holden suggested we take a trip up to the cabin, I thought, why not? Holden and I have been friends since college. He's the kind of guy who always has a new conspiracy theory and a six-pack of cheap beer ready to go. Then there was Sage, the third wheel of our little group. Sage was all about nature and good vibes, always talking about crystals and energy fields. We made an odd trio, but that's what made it work. We set off on a Friday, the drive up taking longer than we'd planned, thanks to Holden's insistence on stopping at every roadside attraction. By the time we reached the cabin, it was already dark. The place looked like it hadn't been touched in years, which, to be fair, it probably hadn't. Uncle Jerry wasn't exactly a neat freak, and I could see the cobwebs in the corners and the dust on every surface. Man, this place is a dump, Holden said, kicking an old can out of the way as we hauled our stuff inside. It's got character, Sage replied, smiling as she placed her hand on the rough wooden walls, like she was communing with the spirit of the cabin itself. I chuckled. Yeah, well, it's free, so I'm not complaining. We spent the first night drinking and telling stories around the fireplace. Holden was in the middle of a particularly outlandish tale about a government cover-up. When we heard the first strange noise, it was a thumping sound, like something heavy had hit the ground outside. We all paused, staring at each other. What the hell was that? Holden asked, his eyes wide. Probably just a raccoon, I said, trying to keep the mood light. Sage always. The peacemaker suggested we go check it out. We grabbed our flashlights and stepped outside into the chilly night. The trees loomed overhead, their branches swaying in the wind. We didn't see anything unusual. Just the usual forest critters scurrying away from our lights. See, nothing to worry about, I said, though I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. The next day we decided to explore the woods. Sage was in her element, pointing out different plants and animal tracks, while Holden and I lagged behind chatting about work and life. It felt good to be out there, away from everything. It was around noon when we found the first sign that something was off. Holden was the one who spotted a strange set of tracks leading away from the path. They were too large to be from any animal I knew, and they seemed to be dragging something. What do you think made these? Holden asked, crouching down to get a better look. Maybe a bear, Sage suggested, though she didn't sound convinced. I shook my head. I've seen bear tracks before, and these don't look right, too long and narrow. We followed the tracks for a while. Our curiosity piqued. They led us deeper into the woods to a small clearing. In the center of the clearing was a large dead tree. Its bark stripped away in places, leaving deep gashes that looked almost like claw marks. This is seriously weird, Holden said, snapping pictures with his phone. Sage was unusually quiet, her eyes fixed on the gashes in the tree. I don't like this, guys, it feels wrong. I was about to suggest we head back when we heard another strange noise, this time closer, a rustling like something large moving through the underbrush. We all turned towards the sound, our hearts pounding. Maybe we should go, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Holden nodded for once, not arguing. We started back the way we came, moving faster. Now the sense of unease grew with every step. It was as if the forest itself was watching us, holding its breath. That night, the atmosphere in the cabin was tense. We tried to distract ourselves with more stories and beer, but the unease lingered. Around midnight, just as we were starting to relax, there was a loud crash outside. This time it sounded like something had hit the side of the cabin. What the hell is that? Holden shouted, jumping to his feet. Stay here, I said, grabbing the flashlight. I'll check it out. Are you crazy? I'm coming with you, Holden insisted, grabbing another flashlight. Sage looked like she wanted to protest, but just nodded, clutching a large kitchen knife. We stepped outside the cold air, hitting us like a slap. The flashlight beams cut through the darkness, revealing nothing out of the ordinary. But then we saw a large, dark shape moving quickly through the trees, too fast for us to make out any details. Did you see that? Holden whispered, his voice shaking. Yeah, I said, my mouth dry. Let'n get back inside. We bolted back into the cabin, slamming the door behind us. Holden locked it, his hands trembling. What did you see? Sage asked, her eyes wide with fear. I don't know, I admitted, something big, too big to be an animal. We didn't sleep much that night. Every noise outside had us on edge, jumping at shadows by morning. We were all exhausted, but determined to figure out what was going on. We need to find out what's out there, Holden said, his jaw set. We can't just sit here and wait for it to come to us. I agreed, though I wasn't thrilled about the idea. Sage was hesitant, but eventually agreed, saying we needed to protect ourselves. We gathered what supplies we could: flashlights, knives, anything that could be used as a weapon, and set out into the woods. The forest was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of birds and insects absent. We followed the same path as before, back to the clearing with the dead tree. The tracks were still there, leading deeper into the woods. As we followed them, we found more signs that something was very wrong: trees with bark stripped away, deep gouges in the ground, and strange, almost human-like footprints. The further we went, the stronger the feeling of being watched became. We reached another clearing. This one larger and more open. In the center was a large flat rock stained dark, with something that looked disturbingly like blood. Holden swore under his breath, taking a step back. "We need to get out of here," Sage said, her voice trembling. I nodded, about to suggest the same, when we heard it. A low, guttural sound like a growl, but not quite. It sent a chill down my spine, and I turned to see a large shadowy figure emerging from the tree's run. I shouted, and we bolted back the way we came. The creature followed, crashing through the underbrush with terrifying speed. I could hear its heavy breathing, feel its presence right behind us. We ran, for what felt like hours, the adrenaline driving us forward. We burst out of the woods and into the clearing around the cabin, slamming the door behind us and barricading it with anything we could find. The creature slammed against the door, snarling and clawing at the wood. I could see its dark, twisted shape through the window, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. "What the hell is that thing?" Holden shouted, his voice breaking. "I don't know," I shouted back, my mind racing, "but it's not getting in here." The creature eventually stopped its assault, retreating back into the woods. We sat in stunned silence, the reality of our situation sinking in. "We can't stay here," Sage said quietly. "We need to leave." I nodded, my mind made up at first light. "We are getting out of here." We spent the rest of the night huddled together, too scared to sleep. When dawn finally came, we packed our things and prepared to leave. The creature hadn't returned, but the sense of dread lingered as we stepped outside. I took one last look at the cabin. It had once been a place of peace and escape, but now it was tainted by fear and darkness. We made our way to the car, our steps quick and nervous. The drive back to the city was silent. Each of us lost in our thoughts. Whatever had happened in those woods had changed us, and we all knew we'd never be the same. A few weeks later I got a call from my uncle. He sounded shaken, his voice trembling, as he told me about the strange things he'd found at the cabin: the claw marks, the tracks, and the blood stains. He said he was selling the place too, scared to ever go back. I couldn't blame him. Whatever was out there, it wasn't something that could be explained or understood. It was a mystery that would stay with us forever. A dark shadow on our memories. Holden and Sage drifted away after that. We all tried to move on, to forget what had happened, but it wasn't that easy. The fear stayed with us, a constant reminder of the unknown lurking in the darkness, and me, I'm still trying to make sense of it all. Maybe one day I'll find the answers, but for now I'm just trying to live my life one day at a time. I used to be a laid-back guy, the kind who thought the worst thing that could happen was my coffee machine breaking down. My name's Alden Raw, and if you'd told me that the craziest day of my life would involve me running for dear life in the middle of the Adera, I'd have laughed you off. But that's exactly what happened on a random Tuesday in 2016. I'm from Watertown, New York, a place where nothing much ever happens. My idea of excitement was winning at poker night with the guys. I used to joke that I was a professional couch potato, taking comfort in routine and predictable days. But life has a way of throwing curveballs. I was part of a small hiking group, more for the social aspect than any real love of nature. We called ourselves the Trail Stompers, a name that made us sound more adventurous than we actually were. That day we decided to explore a less trodden path in the Adera, looking for a change of scenery. There was me, Ricky, his sister Lila, and my old friend Grant. Ricky was our unofficial leader, always boasting about his outdoor skills. Lila, the youngest, tagged along to prove she wasn't just a kid. Grant, the quiet type, was there to enjoy the peace. The day started off normal enough. The sky was overcast, which was actually a relief from the usual scorching sun. We packed our bags, laced up our boots and headed out, bantering and laughing as we navigated the trail. The forest was thick, with the smell of pine and damp earth, and the air was filled with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. After a couple of hours, Ricky suggested we take a detour. He claimed to have found an interesting cave on one of his solo hikes, and, feeling adventurous, we all agreed. The path was barely visible, more of a suggestion than a trail, but Ricky was confident. I remember thinking that it would make a great story to tell later, something to spice up our otherwise mundane lives. About an hour into our detour, things started to feel off. The forest seemed quieter, the air heavier. I shrugged it off as nerves, trying to keep up the cheerful facade. We reached a clearing and there it was, the cave. It was nothing spectacular, just a dark moor in the side of a hill, but it held the promise of mystery. We approached and Ricky, ever the fearless leader, went in first. Lla followed, eager to prove herself. Grant and I were more hesitant, but we didn't want to look like wimps, so we went in after them. The cave was narrow, and the further we went, the colder it got. The light from the entrance quickly faded, leaving us in near darkness. We turned on our flashlights, the beams cutting through the blackness. It was deeper than we expected. The air was stale and the walls were damp. We found some strange markings on the walls, like ancient carvings, but none of us could make sense of them. Ricky was thrilled, speculating wildly about hidden treasures and lost civilizations. Lla was snapping pictures, her excitement contagious. Then we heard a low, almost imperceptible noise. It wasn't the sound of dripping water or shifting rocks, but something else, something alive. We froze, exchanging uneasy glances. Ricky, never one to show fear, insisted it was probably just a bat or some other harmless creature, but the noise grew louder, more distinct. It sounded like something dragging across the floor. Something heavy. Panic started to set in. Ricky tried to lead us out, but the path back seemed different, as if the cave had shifted. While we were inside, the noise followed us, getting closer. We quickened our pace, but the cave seemed to stretch on endlessly. Our flashlights flickered, adding to the growing sense of dread. Then we saw it. At first it was just a shadow, an indistinct shape moving in the darkness. But as it got closer, the details became horrifyingly clear. It was tall, hunched and covered in matted fur. Its limbs were naturally long, and its fingers ended in sharp claws. It moved with a disturbing grace. Each step deliberate and silent. Ricky, in a rare moment of panic, shouted for us to run. We bolted, the adrenaline overriding our fear. The cave twisted and turned and we stumbled and fell, the creature always just behind us. We reached a fork and in the chaos we got separated. Ricky and Lila went one way. Grant and I the other. Grant and I ran until our lungs burned, finally bursting out into the daylight. We collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath. The forest was eerily silent, the trees looming over us like silent sentinels. We waited, expecting Ricky and Lla to appear any moment, but they didn't. Minutes turned to hours. We called out, our voices echoing through the forest. There was no response. Grant, usually so stoic, looked shaken. We argued about what to do next. I wanted to go back in to find them, but Grant was adamant that we needed help. Reluctantly, I agreed. We made our way back to the main trail, every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves making us jump. When we finally reached our cars, we called the local authorities. They organized a search party, but as the hours passed, hope dwindled, the sun was setting and the forest took on a more sinister tone. The search lasted all night and into the next day. They found no trace of Ricky or Lila. The cave, when they located it, seemed to have collapsed, as if the earth itself had swallowed it up. The markings we had seen were gone, replaced by smooth, unblemished rock. The authorities chalked it up to a tragic accident, but Grant and I knew better. Weeks passed and life returned to a semblance of normality. But the memory of that day haunted me. I couldn't shake the feeling that Ricky and Lila were still out there somewhere in the darkness. I spent countless nights researching, trying to find any mention of similar creatures or disappearances. I found whispers of legends, stories passed down through generations about creatures that lived in the depths of the earth, but nothing concrete. Grant moved away, unable to cope with the memories. I stayed, driven by a need to understand, to find closure. I visited the forest, often hoping against hope to find some clue, some sign of what had happened, but the forest remained silent. The cave hidden away, its secrets buried deep. Then, one day I received a package. It was from Lila. At least that's what the return address said. My hands trembled as I opened it, revealing a journal in a flash drive. The journal was filled with Light Mill's handwriting detailing their experiences after we got separated. According to her, they had found another way out of the cave, only to be hunted by the creature in the forest. The last entry was a frantic scrawl describing how Ricky had stayed behind to distract the creature, giving her a chance to escape. The flash drive contained photos, blurry but unmistakable, of the creature. I took the evidence to the authorities, but they dismissed it as a hoax, a cruel prank. I was left with more questions than answers, my mind. A whirlwind of confusion and fear. The forest, once a place of peace, had become a symbol of terror. Years have passed since that day. I've learned to live with the uncertainty, the not knowing, but every so often I find myself drawn back to the Adera, to the place where it all began. I stand at the edge of the forest, listening to the sounds of nature, and I wonder if the creature is still out there waiting. And in those moments, I swear, I can hear a low, dragging noise echoing through the trees. As for Ricky and Lila, their disappearance remains unsolved. They are just two more names in a long list of people who went missing in the wilderness. I've made peace with the fact that I may never know the full truth, but the memories of that day are etched in my mind forever. In the end, I suppose I've changed. I'm no longer the carefree guy who thought the worst thing that could happen was a broken coffee machine. Life has a way of altering your perspective, of showing you that there are things out there, things we can't explain, things that can change your life in an instant. My name is Walter Kendler, and this happened to me back in 1995. I was a small-town cop in Reston, Idaho, a place so small that everyone knew everyone. I'd lived there all my life and figured I'd die there too, probably in my own bed. I was wrong about that last part. I joined the force because honestly there wasn't much else to do. The most excitement we got was the occasional bar fight, or some kids spray painting the water tower. We didn't even have a donut shop, which, let me tell you, is a travesty for a cop. I liked the routine of it, though, and the feeling of being useful, of helping out my neighbors. One late shift I got a call from dispatch about a missing person. Mrs. Clara Rollins had reported that her husband, George, hadn't come home. Now George wasn't the type to wander off. He ran the hardware store, and he was as steady as they come. I drove over to their house, the kind with the white picket fence and the rose bushes out front. Clara was in tears. When I got there, she was clutching a dish towel and pacing the living room. "Walter, something's wrong. George would never stay out like this without calling," she said, her voice trembling. I tried to calm her down. "Maybe his truck broke down. Clara, I'll go take a look around town, see if I can find him." "Don't worry." I hopped back into my cruiser and started making rounds. Rest's not big, so it didn't take long to check the usual spots: his store, the diner and even the old abandoned sawmill where kids like to mess around. But there was no sign of George. That's when I decided to head out to Old Mill Road. It's this narrow, winding stretch that runs through the woods. Not many people use it. Since the new highway got built, as I was driving, the beam of my headlights caught something off to the side. It was George's truck parked haphazardly on the shoulder. I pulled over and got out, flashlight in hand. The air was cool and the only sounds were the crickets in the distant hoot of an owl. "George!" I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness. No answer. I walked over to the truck and shined my light inside. It was empty, but the driver's door was open and George's hat was lying on the ground. I picked it up and looked around. That's when I noticed a faint trail leading into the woods. It wasn't much, just a disturbance in the underbrush, but it was enough. I radioed in my location and that I was going to investigate. "Be careful," Walter said, dispatch, but I didn't think much of it. This was George Rollins. We were talking about not some dangerous fugitive. I followed the trail, pushing through the brush and trying not to trip over roots. After about 10 minutes of walking, I saw a light up ahead. I moved closer and the trees opened into a small clearing. There was a fire burning and next to it was George. He was tied to a tree, gagged and looking more terrified than I'd ever seen anyone. Look, before I could react, something hard hit me on the back of the head. I went down, my flashlight rolling away into the darkness. Pain exploded in my skull and I struggled to stay conscious. A voice, low and menacing, cut through the fog in my brain. "Shouldn't have come here, cop." I rolled onto my back and saw a man standing over me. He was tall, with a wild tangle of hair and a crazed look in his eyes. His clothes were filthy and he had a knife in his hand, not just any knife, a hunting knife big enough to gut a deer. I tried to reach for my gun, but he kicked me hard in the ribs and I gasped for breath. "You think you can stop me?" he said, laughing. "You're just a small-town cop. You don't even know what you're dealing with." My head was spinning, but I forced myself to focus. I needed to get out of this alive and, more importantly, I needed to get George out of there. "What do you want?" I croaked, trying to buy some time. He sneered at me. "People don't come out here by accident. George here found out the hard way, thought he could snoop around, figure out what I was doing." I glanced at George, who was struggling against his bonds. Whatever this guy was up to, it wasn't good. I needed to act fast. "You don't have to do this," I said, trying to sound calm. "Let George go and we can talk about this." He laughed again. A harsh grating sound. "Oh, we're way past talking. I'm just getting started with that." He lunged at me, knife raised. I rolled to the side, pain shooting through my ribs, and grabbed a fallen branch. It wasn't much, but it was something. I swung it at him, hitting his arm and knocking the knife out of his hand. He cursed and came at me again, fists flying. We grappled on the ground, each trying to gain the upper hand. He was strong, but I was fighting for my life. I managed to get on top of him and punched him hard in the face. His head snapped back and for a moment he was dazed. I used that moment to scramble to my feet and grab the knife. He came at me again, but this time I was ready. I slashed at him, cutting his arm. Blood spurted and he howled in pain. I didn't wait for him to recover. I turned and ran to George, cutting the ropes that held him. "Run!" I shouted, pushing George toward the trail. We stumbled through the woods. The sounds of our pursuit close behind. My heart was pounding, adrenaline surging through me. We had to make it to the road. If we could get to the road, we'd be safe. We burst out of the woods and I saw the lights of my cruiser up ahead. I fumbled for my keys, hands shaking, and managed to unlock the doors. We jumped in and I started the engine, tires screeching as we sped away. "Are you okay?" I asked George, glancing over at him. He was pale and shaken but nodded. "Thanks, Walter. I thought I was a goner." We drove straight to the station, and I called for backup. We needed to catch this guy before he hurt anyone else. Within minutes, the place was swarming with cops and a search party was organized. Hours later they found him. He was dead, lying in the same clearing where I'd found George. His own knife was in his chest and the look of surprise was frozen on his face. The investigation revealed that he was a drifter, someone who'd been living off the grid, preying on unsuspecting people who wandered too close. George had stumbled upon his campsite while hiking and the guy had taken him prisoner, probably intending to kill him live, and Reston went back to normal after that, but it left a mark on all of us. Clara never let George out of her sight again, and I carried a scar on my ribs where he kicked me. It was a reminder that even in a small town, danger could lurk just around the corner. For me, it was a wake-up call. I took my job more seriously, kept my eyes open and made sure I was always prepared. It wasn't the life I'd imagined, but it was the one I had and I was determined to make the most of it. Sometimes I'd think back to that night and wonder what would have happened if I hadn't found George in time, but I didn't dwell on it. I had a job to do and people counting on me. That was enough. My name is Lel Garrett, and this happened to me on September 23, 2003. I was working as a search and rescue officer in the dense sprawling forests of northern Idaho, a place that had seen its fair share of hikers and hunters go missing over the years. We used to joke that the forest had a way of swallowing people whole, but I never thought I'd experience its darker side firsthand. It started like any other day. I was with my team doing a routine sweep for a missing person. A young woman named Claire Whitaker had been reported missing by her boyfriend after she went on a solo hike and didn't return. We got the call early in the morning and headed out as soon as the sun rose. My partner for the day was Mark Lewin, a seasoned officer with a non-nonsense attitude. We geared up, double-checked our radios and set off into the woods. The air was crisp, the kind that makes your lungs feel clean. We followed the trail. CLA had taken chatting about the usual stuff: sports, family, the occasional gripe about work. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. After a couple of hours of hiking and calling out Claire's name, we reached a clearing where the trail split into 3 different paths. Mark and I decided to split up and cover more ground. I took the left path, which led deeper into the forest, while Mark took the right. We agreed to check in every half hour. I walked for about 20 minutes, calling out Claire's name every few steps. The trees were thick here, and the sunlight barely pierced through the canopy. It was quiet, the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're the only person left in the world. I'd been on countless searches, but something about this one felt different. I couldn't shake a feeling of unease. I was about to turn back, when I noticed something on the ground, a bright blue scar tangled in some bushes. I picked it up and recognized it from the description Claire's boyfriend had given us. I radioed Mark and told him I'd found a clue. He told me to stay put and that he'd join me soon. As I waited, I heard a rustling noise behind me. I turned around expecting to see Mark, or maybe a deer, but there was nothing, just the trees and the underbrush. I shrugged it off, as my imagination playing tricks on me. After all, the forest can be a strange place when you're alone. Mark arrived a few minutes later, and I showed him the scarf. We decided to follow the direction it was pointing, hoping it would lead us to Claire. We walked for another 15 minutes, when we stumbled upon a small campsite. It looked abandoned, but recent. There was a smoldering fire pit, a half-eaten sandwich on a log and a backpack leaning against a tree. "Claire, are you here?" Mark shouted. His voice echoed through the trees, but there was no response. We searched the campsite for any signs of struggle or a note, but found nothing. It was like she had just vanished. Mark and I exchanged worried glances. We knew time was of the essence, so we decided to keep moving forward in the direction the campsite seemed to lead. The deeper we went, the thicker the trees became. The path was barely visible, now more of a suggestion than a trail. It was getting harder to move and the feeling of being watched was growing stronger. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something lurking in the shadows. Then we found her. CLA was sitting on the ground, leaning against a tree, staring blankly ahead. Her clothes were torn and her face was scratched up, but she was alive. We rushed to her and she flinched at our approach. "Claire, it's okay, we're here to help you," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. She looked at us, her eyes wide with terror. "He's coming." She whispered. "Who's coming?" Mark asked, glancing around nervously. "The man in the woods. Heck been following me," she said, her voice trembling. Mark and I exchanged another look. We'd heard stories about people seeing things in the forest, but we always chalked it up to fear and exhaustion. This felt different. "Let's get you out of here," I said, helping CLA to her feet. She was shaky but managed to stand. We started back towards the trail, keeping a close watch on our surroundings. We hadn't gone far when we heard it, a faint rustling like something moving through the underbrush. We stopped and Mark drew his pistol. "Who's there?" he called out. No answer, just the rustling getting closer. "Go," Mark said, pushing CLA and me forward. We broke into a run, crashing through the forest, the rustling now turning into the sound of footsteps chasing us. My heart pounded in my chest and my mind raced with thoughts of what might be following us. We burst out into the clearing, where the trail split, and didn't stop until we reached the main path. The footsteps behind us faded away, but we didn't slow down. We kept running until we saw the familiar sight of our vehicles parked at the trail head. We got Claire into the back of one of the trucks and radioed for medical assistance. She was in shock, but otherwise okay. Mark and I stood by the truck trying to catch our breath. "What the hell was that?" Mark asked, wiping sweat from his brow. "I don't know, but I don't think we should stick around to find out," I replied. We waited with CLA until the paramedics arrived and took her to the hospital. Mark and I gave our statements to the local sheriff, who looked as puzzled as we felt. There were no reports of any suspicious individuals in the area, and no one had seen anything unusual over the next few days. We kept an eye on the news, but nothing came up. CLA recovered, but she didn't have much to say about what happened to her. She couldn't describe the man she claimed was following her, and the whole thing remained a mystery. I went back to work, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I started paying more attention to the missing persons reports in the area and noticed a disturbing trend. People were disappearing in the same part of the forest where we found Claire, and they were never found. Months went by and the disappearances continued. Mark and I were called out on more searches, but we never found any trace of the missing people. It was like the forest had swallowed them whole, just like we used to joke about. One evening I was sitting at home going through some old case files when I came across a report from the 1980s. It described a series of disappearances in the same area, with witnesses reporting seeing a man lurking in the woods. The description matched what Claire had said, down to the eerie silence and the feeling of being watched. I started digging deeper, talking to old-timers and retired officers who remembered the cases. They all said the same thing. There was something in those woods, something that didn't want to be found. I don't know what it was that Claire saw, or what happened to all those missing people, but I do know that the forest is a place of secrets, and some of them are better left undisturbed. Years later I retired from search and rescue. I moved to a small town in Oregon, far from the forests of Idaho, but sometimes when I'm alone at night I think about Claire and the others who went missing. I think about the man in the woods and wonder if he's still out there waiting for his next victim. I don't tell this story to scare people, but to remind them that nature can be unpredictable and dangerous. It's a lesson I learned the hard way, and one I hope others take to heart. Stay safe and always be aware of your surroundings. You never know what might be lurking in the shadows, and so life goes on. The forest remains, and so do its secrets. My name is Gordon Tilbury, and this happened to me back in 1997 in a little-known place called Edgewood, Texas. I was a bit of a drifter back then, traveling from town to town doing odd jobs to make ends meet. I wasn't looking for trouble, but trouble sure knew how to find me. Edgewood was a quiet out off-the-way town with a population just shy of 1,000. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone and strangers were noticed immediately. I had been in town for about a week, picking up work at the local auto shop owned by a grizzled old man named Frank Burkett. Frank didn't talk much, but he paid cash and didn't ask questions, which suited me just fine. One evening, after a long day of changing tires and tuning engines, I decided to head over to the only bar in town. The Rusty Nail. It was a small, dimly lit joint with a handful of regulars nursing their drinks. I ordered a beer and took a seat at the bar, making small talk with the bartender, a young woman named Ellie you knew around here. She said, her eyes narrowing slightly as she wiped down the counter. Yeah. Just passing through, I replied, taking a sip of my beer. Name's Gordon. Nice to meet you, Gordon. I'm Ellie, just a heads up. We don't get many newcomers in Edgewood. Folks around here can be a bit suspicious. I chuckled. Noted, I just need a place to crash for a while, earn some money and then I'll be on my way. As the night wore on, a few more patrons drifted in, including a burly man named Cyrus Vunder. If you're still craving more tales from the wild, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join us on the next expedition.